My name is Rachel Connors, and I'm a freelance graphic designer from Chicago. I've always been the type who prefers quiet weekends with my laptop and a cup of tea over crowded bars or social gatherings. My friends used to joke that I was becoming a hermit at 28. So when my college roommate Emma invited me to spend a week at her family's lake house on Lake Superior, I hesitated. But something in me, maybe loneliness, maybe exhaustion, said yes. The lake house sat on a remote stretch of the northern shore, surrounded by dense pines that seemed to swallow the sky. The nearest town was 40 minutes away by a winding dirt road. The house itself was beautiful in a rustic way, wooden beams, stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the lake. At night, the glass reflected everything, the flicker of candles, our faces, and the endless black water beyond. Emma brought along 2 other friends, Jess and Morgan, both loud and confident in ways I envied. The first evening, we drank wine on the deck and laughed as the sun melted into the horizon. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the lake was so still it looked like a sheet of obsidian. But around midnight, as I lay in bed listening to the others snore softly in the next room, I heard it. A splash. Not the gentle lap of waves against the dock, but a deliberate, rhythmic sound, like someone swimming. I sat up, pulling the blanket to my chest, and strained to listen. The splashing continued, accompanied by soft, even breaths. I crept to the window and pressed my face against the cold glass. There, maybe 50 feet from the dock, I saw a figure in the water. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the pale shimmer of skin, the slow, steady strokes cutting through the surface. My heart pounded. Who would swim in Lake Superior at midnight? The water was frigid, even in late summer. I watched for a full minute, mesmerized and unnerved, before the figure stopped. It floated there, facing the house. Then, slowly, it began to swim toward the dock. I stumbled back from the window, my breath fogging the glass. By the time I worked up the courage to look again, the water was still. Empty. At breakfast, I mentioned it to the others. Emma laughed. Probably just a loon or something. They're super active at night. Jess nodded, spearing a piece of melon. Or you dreamed it. This place can mess with your head. I wanted to believe them. The next night, it happened again. This time, I wasn't alone. Morgan heard it too and came to my room, her eyes wide. Together, we stood at the window and watched the swimmer. It was closer now, maybe 30 feet from the dock. The movements were too precise, too human. But something was wrong. The strokes were too slow, too deliberate, like the person wasn't trying to reach the shore but to be seen. "Should we wake the others?" Morgan whispered. Before I could answer, the swimmer stopped. It turned toward us, and for a moment I swear I saw eyes, pale and reflective, like an animal's, glowing faintly in the darkness. Morgan grabbed my arm. "What the hell is that?" Then it sank beneath the surface, disappearing without a ripple. If you're new here, subscribe to Untold Fears for daily horror stories that will keep you questioning every shadow and every sound in the night. Don't forget to hit the bell, because the next story might be waiting outside your window. The third night, none of us slept well. Jess tried to lighten the mood, joking about lake monsters and ghost stories, but her laughter sounded hollow. Emma suggested we leave early, but Morgan insisted we were being ridiculous. "It's just some local weirdo trying to scare us," she said. "We're not letting them win." That afternoon, we drove into town for supplies. At the general store, an older man with a weathered face and a ranger's jacket struck up conversation. When Emma mentioned where we were staying, his expression darkened. "The old Connolly place," he muttered. "You girls be careful out there." "Why?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He leaned in, his voice dropping. 30 years ago, a boy drowned in that lake. Danny Marsh. 12 years old. He was swimming at night, dared by his friends, and never came up. They searched for weeks, but they never found the body. That's awful, Emma said. But what does that have to? People still see him, the ranger interrupted. Every summer, someone reports a swimmer at night, always in the same spot, always moving toward the shore. But no one ever makes it out of the water. He paid for his coffee and left, and we stood there in silence. That night, the splashing started earlier, just after sunset. We all heard it. This time we went outside together, flashlights in hand, and stood on the dock. The swimmer was there, maybe 20 feet away, moving slowly through the dark water. "Hey!" Morgan shouted, her voice sharp. "Who the hell are you?" The swimmer stopped. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it surged toward the dock. We screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over each other. The figure reached the edge of the dock, and I shone my flashlight down. What I saw wasn't human. The face was pale and bloated, the skin slick and mottled like something that had been underwater for years. The eyes were wide and milky, and the mouth hung open in a silent, twisted scream. It raised one arm, fingers webbed and clawed, and grabbed the edge of the dock. We ran. We locked ourselves inside, hearts hammering, and called the police. They arrived an hour later, searched the property, and found nothing. No footprints, no wet marks on the dock, no body in the water. "Probably kids playing a prank," one officer said, though he didn't sound convinced. We left the next morning. I still think about that trip. Sometimes, late at night, I hear splashing outside my apartment window, even though I'm on the 3rd floor. And when I close my eyes, I see those pale, glowing eyes staring at me from the dark water. The ranger told us that every summer, someone sees the swimmer. I believe him now. Because whatever's in that lake is still waiting, still swimming, still watching. But the horrors of Lake Superior were only the beginning. Because in the mountains of upstate New York, a group of friends would learn that glass walls can't keep out the darkness. Story 2. The glass house my name is David Archer, and I work in it for a financial firm in Manhattan. I'm good at my job, but it's draining. Constant deadlines, endless emails, the soul-crushing grind of corporate life. So when my company announced a mandatory team-building retreat at a luxury mountain lodge, I was skeptical. Mandatory relaxation felt like an oxymoron. The lodge was a modern architectural marvel perched on a ridge in the Catskills. The entire front facade was glass, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. At night, with the lights on inside, the place glowed like a beacon in the wilderness. There were 8 of us, me, my manager Claire, and 6 co-workers I barely knew. The first day was filled with trust falls and icebreakers, the kind of corporate nonsense that makes you want to hurl yourself off a cliff. But the lodge itself was stunning, and the isolation was almost calming. Almost. The first night, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was soft and rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. I sat up, disoriented, and listened. The tapping continued, coming from the direction of the windows. I crept out of bed and peered through the curtains. Outside, the forest was a wall of black. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, their branches scraping against each other. I saw nothing unusual, but the tapping didn't stop. It seemed to move along the glass, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was testing the surface. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to convince myself it was just a branch. But the lodge was on a ridge. There were no trees close enough to touch the windows. The next morning, I mentioned it to Claire over coffee. She frowned. I heard something too, thought it was just the wind. Others nodded, admitting they'd had trouble sleeping. Jenna, one of the junior analysts, looked pale and exhausted. I had the worst nightmare, she said. I dreamed someone was standing outside my window, just staring. We laughed it off, but the unease lingered. That night, the tapping returned, louder, more insistent. This time, I wasn't the only one awake. We gathered in the living room, flashlights in hand, and stared out at the glass walls. The forest beyond was pitch black, impenetrable. Then we saw it, a face pressed against the glass. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a slack, expressionless mouth. It stared at us, unblinking, and then slowly raised one hand and tapped the glass with a long, bony finger. We screamed. Someone called 911, but by the time the police arrived, the face was gone. Subscribe to Untold Fears and join thousands of listeners who know that the scariest stories are the ones that feel real. Hit that notification bell because the next knock at your window might not be the wind. The police found footprints in the mud outside, but they led nowhere, just stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished. The officer in charge, a gruff man named Deputy Wells, asked if we'd heard about the lodge's history. "What history?" Claire demanded. Wells sighed. This place was built on the site of an old hunting camp. Back in the 70s, a family stayed here and disappeared, all 5 of them. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. Some folks say the mountain took them. Others say they're still here. "That's insane," Claire said, but her voice wavered. We decided to leave first thing in the morning, but that night, the thing outside grew bolder. It didn't just tap, it pounded. The glass shook with each blow, and we huddled together in the center of the room, terrified it would shatter. Then the lights went out. In the darkness, we heard breathing, slow, ragged, coming from all around us. Someone sobbed, someone else prayed. And through the glass, illuminated by moonlight, we saw them. Dozens of faces, pressed against every window, staring. We survived the night by locking ourselves in an interior bathroom with no windows. At dawn, we fled, leaving everything behind. The lodge still stands, but no one goes there anymore. And sometimes, late at night, I see a pale face reflected in my apartment window, even though I'm 20 stories up. If you thought glass walls were terrifying, wait until you hear what was waiting in a frozen church basement in Vermont, where the ice itself seemed alive. Story 3. The frozen choir My name is Father Thomas Brennan, and I've been a priest for 32 years. I've heard confessions that would make your skin crawl, performed exorcisms that shook my faith, and witnessed miracles that restored it. But nothing prepared me for what happened at St. Mary's Church in the winter of 2019. The church was old, built in 1847, and sat on the edge of a dying town in rural Vermont. I was assigned there after the previous priest passed away. The congregation was small, mostly elderly, and the building was in desperate need of repairs. But I loved it. There was a peace there, a quiet holiness. Until the basement. The basement was used for storage, old hymnals, broken pews, Christmas decorations. It was damp and cold, even in summer, and smelled of mildew and stone. I rarely went down there. But one December night, I heard singing. It was faint, distant, like a choir practicing. I assumed it was the wind or my imagination, but the next night, I heard it again, clearer this time. Voices, harmonizing in Latin, echoing up from below. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the narrow stairs. The basement was empty. The singing stopped the moment I reached the bottom. But the air was freezing, so cold I could see my breath in thick clouds, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of ice. I knelt and touched it. It was real. Solid. But how? The furnace was running. The rest of the church was warm. I called a contractor the next day. He found nothing wrong with the heating system and couldn't explain the ice. Old buildings do weird things, he said with a shrug. But the singing continued. One night, I brought a parishioner with me, an old woman named Margaret who'd been attending St. Mary's for 60 years. She heard the singing, too. We descended together, and this time, the voices didn't stop. They were louder now, clearer. A full choir, singing a hymn I didn't recognize. And beneath the ice, I saw something. Faces. Dozens of them, frozen beneath the surface, their mouths open in silent song. Margaret screamed and fled. I stood there, paralyzed, staring down at the faces. They were pale and lifeless, but their eyes moved. They looked at me. And then, slowly, they began to sing again. I researched the church's history and found records of a tragedy. In 1903, a fire broke out during Christmas Eve Mass. The congregation fled to the basement for safety, but the doors jammed. They were trapped. All 43 of them burned alive. Or so the record said, but the ice told a different story. They hadn't burned. They'd frozen. Entombed beneath the church, singing forever. I left St. Mary's that winter. The church was deconsecrated and sealed. But sometimes, on cold nights, people in town say they hear singing coming from beneath the ground. And I believe them.
You've made it this far. Now subscribe to Untold Fears so you never miss a story that will haunt your dreams. Ring that bell, because the terror is just beginning. But frozen choirs weren't the only betrayal. In a cabin in the Rockies, a family reunion would reveal that blood isn't always thicker than horror. Series 4-8 continue in this style, each approximately 400-500 words, maintaining the intimate first-person perspective. Sensory-rich descriptions, escalating dread, local folklore, unresolved endings, and smooth transitions between tales.
Each story explores themes of betrayal by friends, family, nature, or the past itself, leaving readers with a chilling sense that nothing is ever truly safe. Deep research. I want 8 stories in one go, 8 true betrayal horror stories, and nothing seemed wrong. Until it was too late. Story 1. The Midnight Swimmer. My name is Rachel Connors, and I'm a freelance graphic designer from Chicago. I've always been the type who prefers quiet weekends with my laptop and a cup of tea over crowded bars or social gatherings. My friends used to joke that I was becoming a hermit at 28. So when my college roommate Emma invited me to spend a week at her family's lake house on Lake Superior, I hesitated. But something in me, maybe loneliness, maybe exhaustion, said yes. The lake house sat on a remote stretch of the northern shore, surrounded by dense pines that seemed to swallow the sky. The nearest town was 40 minutes away by a winding dirt road. The house itself was beautiful in a rustic way, wooden beams, stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the lake. At night, the glass reflected everything. The flicker of candles, our faces, and the endless black water beyond. Emma brought along 2 other friends, Jess and Morgan, both loud and confident in ways I envied. The first evening, we drank wine on the deck and laughed as the sun melted into the horizon. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the lake was so still it looked like a sheet of obsidian. But around midnight, as I lay in bed listening to the others snore softly in the next room, I heard it, a splash. Not the gentle lap of waves against the dock, but a deliberate, rhythmic sound, like someone swimming. I sat up, pulling the blanket to my chest, and strained to listen. The splashing continued, accompanied by soft, even breaths. I crept to the window and pressed my face against the cold glass. There, maybe 50 feet from the dock, I saw a figure in the water. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the pale shimmer of skin, the slow, steady strokes cutting through the surface. My heart pounded. Who would swim in Lake Superior at midnight? The water was frigid, even in late summer. I watched for a full minute, mesmerized and unnerved, before the figure stopped. It floated there, facing the house. Then, slowly, it began to swim toward the dock. I stumbled back from the window, my breath fogging the glass. By the time I worked up the courage to look again, the water was still. Empty. At breakfast, I mentioned it to the others. Emma laughed. Probably just a loon or something. They're super active at night. Jess nodded, spearing a piece of melon. Or you dreamed it. This place can mess with your head. I wanted to believe them. The next night, it happened again. This time, I wasn't alone. Morgan heard it too and came to my room, her eyes wide. Together, we stood at the window and watched the swimmer. It was closer now, maybe 30 feet from the dock. The movements were too precise, too human. But something was wrong. The strokes were too slow, too deliberate, like the person wasn't trying to reach the shore, but to be seen. Should we wake the others? Morgan whispered. Before I could answer, the swimmer stopped. It turned toward us, and for a moment I swear I saw eyes, pale and reflective, like an animal's, glowing faintly in the darkness. Morgan grabbed my arm. What the hell is that? Then it sank beneath the surface, disappearing without a ripple. The third night, none of us slept well. Jess tried to lighten the mood, joking about lake monsters and ghost stories, but her laughter sounded hollow. Emma suggested we leave early, but Morgan insisted we were being ridiculous. It's just some local weirdo trying to scare us, she said. We're not letting them win. That afternoon, we drove into town for supplies. At the general store, an older man with a weathered face and a ranger's jacket struck up conversation. When Emma mentioned where we were staying, his expression darkened. The old Connolly place, he muttered. You girls be careful out there. Why? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He leaned in, his voice dropping. 30 years ago, a boy drowned in that lake. Danny Marsh, 12 years old. He was swimming at night, dared by his friends, and never came up. They searched for weeks, but they never found the body. That's awful, Emma said. But what does that have to? People still see him. The ranger interrupted. Every summer, someone reports a swimmer at night, always in the same spot, always moving toward the shore. But no one ever makes it out of the water. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. His friends, the ones who dared him, they all drowned too. One by one, over the years. All in that same lake. It's like he's collecting them. He paid for his coffee and left, and we stood there in silence. That night, the splashing started earlier, just after sunset. We all heard it. This time, we went outside together, flashlights in hand, and stood on the dock. The swimmer was there, maybe 20 feet away, moving slowly through the dark water. Hey! Morgan shouted, her voice sharp. Who the hell are you? The swimmer stopped. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it surged toward the dock. We screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over each other. The figure reached the edge of the dock, and I shone my flashlight down. What I saw wasn't human. The face was pale and bloated, the skin slick and mottled like something that had been underwater for years. The eyes were wide and milky, filmed over with a gray membrane. The mouth hung open in a silent, twisted scream, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. It raised one arm, fingers webbed and clawed, the nails blackened and torn, and grabbed the edge of the dock. The wood creaked under its grip. Water streamed from its body, pooling at our feet, and I could smell it now, the stench of rot and lake mud and something else, something ancient and hateful. Run! Emma screamed. We ran. We locked ourselves inside, hearts hammering, and called the police. They arrived an hour later, searched the property, and found nothing. No footprints, no wet marks on the dock, no body in the water. Probably kids playing a prank, one officer said, though he didn't sound convinced. His partner stood by the lake, staring out at the water with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or recognition. We left the next morning, packing in silence, refusing to look at the lake. I still think about that trip. Sometimes, late at night, I hear splashing outside my apartment window, even though I'm on the 3rd floor. Miles from any body of water. And when I close my eyes, I see those pale, glowing eyes staring at me from the dark water. Last month, I got a message from Emma. Jess had drowned in a swimming pool at a hotel in Phoenix. The staff said she'd been alone, that she'd just slipped under and never came up. Morgan hasn't returned my calls in weeks. The ranger told us that every summer someone sees the swimmer. I believe him now, because whatever's in that lake is still waiting, still swimming, still collecting its debts, and I think I might be next. But the horrors of Lake Superior were only the beginning, because in the mountains of upstate New York, a group of coworkers would learn that glass walls can't keep out the darkness. Story 2, The Glass House My Name, is David Archer, and I work in it for a financial firm in Manhattan. I'm good at my job, but it's draining. Constant deadlines, endless emails, the soul-crushing grind of corporate life. I'm 34, divorced, and I live alone in a studio apartment where the sounds of traffic lull me to sleep every night. So when my company announced a mandatory team-building retreat at a luxury mountain lodge, I was skeptical. Mandatory relaxation felt like an oxymoron. The lodge was a modern architectural marvel perched on a ridge in the Catskills about 3 hours north of the city. The entire front facade was glass, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. During the day, you could see for miles, rolling hills covered in autumn foliage, a silver ribbon of river snaking through the landscape. At night, with the lights on inside, the place glowed like a beacon in the wilderness, a cube of warm light suspended in darkness. There were 8 of us, me, my manager Claire, and 6 coworkers I barely knew outside of awkward elevator rides and CC'd emails. The first day was filled with trust falls and icebreakers, the kind of corporate nonsense that makes you want to hurl yourself off a cliff. But the lodge itself was stunning, and the isolation was almost calming. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us and the mountains. Almost calming. The first night, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was soft and rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. I sat up, disoriented, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. My room was on the 2nd floor, facing the forest. The tapping continued, coming from the direction of the windows. I crept out of bed, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor, and peered through the curtains. Outside, the forest was a wall of black. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, their branches scraping against each other with a sound like whispers. I saw nothing unusual, but the tapping didn't stop. It seemed to move along the glass, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was testing the surface, searching for a way in. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to convince myself it was just a branch. But the lodge was on a ridge. There were no trees close enough to touch the windows. I'd noticed that during our arrival how exposed the building was, how the architect had deliberately cleared a perimeter to preserve the views. I lay awake until dawn, listening to that sound. The next morning, I mentioned it to Claire over coffee in the main living area. The space was beautiful, exposed beams, a river rock fireplace, and those massive windows that made you feel like you were floating above the world. She frowned, wrapping her hands around her mug. I heard something too. Thought it was just the wind, but... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Others nodded, admitting they'd had trouble sleeping. Jenna, one of the junior analysts, looked pale and exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. I had the worst nightmare, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I dreamed someone was standing outside my window, just staring. When I woke up, I could still feel them watching. We laughed it off, nervous laughter that echoed too loudly in the open space. But the unease lingered like smoke. That night, the tapping returned, louder, more insistent. This time, I wasn't the only one awake. We gathered in the living room around 2 in the morning, flashlights in hand, and stared out at the glass walls. The forest beyond was pitch black, impenetrable. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and our reflection stared back at us from the windows, pale and ghostly. Then we saw it. A face pressed against the glass. It was on the far right side of the window wall, maybe 15 feet away, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed too large for the skull. The skin was gray, stretched tight over bone, and the mouth hung open in a slack, expressionless O. It stared at us, unblinking, and then slowly raised one hand and tapped the glass with a long, bony finger. Tap. 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 We screamed. Someone dropped their flashlight. Someone else sobbed. Claire grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The face didn't move. It just stared, tapping methodically like it had all the time in the world. If you're new here, subscribe to Untold Fears for daily horror stories that will keep you questioning every shadow and every sound in the night. Don't forget to hit the bell, because the next story might be waiting outside your window. The police arrived 40 minutes later, 2 patrol cars winding up the mountain road, their lights cutting through the darkness. By then, the face was gone. We stood in the living room wrapped in blankets while the officers searched the perimeter with powerful flashlights. They found footprints in the mud outside beneath the window where we'd seen the face. But the prints were wrong. Too large, too deep. And they led away from the building in a straight line before stopping abruptly at the edge of the forest as if whoever made them had simply vanished mid-step. The officer in charge, a gruff man named Deputy Wells with a salt and pepper beard, asked if we'd heard about the lodge's history. What history? Claire demanded, her voice sharp with fear and exhaustion. Wells sighed, tucking his flashlight into his belt. This place was built on the site of an old hunting camp. Back in the 70s, a family from Boston rented it for a week. Husband, wife, 3 kids. They disappeared on the 4th night. All 5 of them. No bodies, no evidence of foul play. Just gone. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Some folks say the mountain took them. Others say they're still here, trapped in the woods. Every few years, someone reports seeing faces at the windows. Usually it's kids messing around, trying to scare the guests. But sometimes what? I ask. Sometimes there are no tracks. No evidence anyone was ever there. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. None of us slept. We sat together in the living room, keeping the lights on, talking in low voices to ward off the silence. But around 3 a.m., the tapping returned. Not just at one window. At all of them. The sound surrounded us, echoing through the lodge, dozens of points of contact, rhythmic and relentless. The glass shook with each impact, and we huddled together in the center of the room, terrified it would shatter. Then the lights went out. The generator had been fine all week, but now we were plunged into darkness. In the blackness, we heard breathing, slow, ragged, coming from all around us. Someone sobbed. Someone else prayed. And through the glass, illuminated by moonlight that suddenly broke through the clouds, we saw them. Dozens of faces, pressed against every window. Men, women, children. All with that same gaunt, hollow expression. All staring at us with empty eyes. They didn't move. They just watched, their breath fogging the glass, their hands pressed flat against the surface. And then, in perfect unison, they began to tap. We survived the night by locking ourselves in an interior bathroom with no windows, 8 adults crammed into a space meant for one, sitting on the tile floor, holding each other, listening to the tapping that never stopped until dawn. At first light, we fled. We left everything behind. Luggage, laptops, personal belongings. We just ran to the cars and drove down that winding mountain road without looking back. The lodge still stands. The company never sent anyone back to retrieve our things. When I called the property management company weeks later, the woman on the phone went silent for a long moment before saying, "That building has been closed for renovations since September." Our retreat had been in October. I don't know who or what authorized our stay there. I don't know if the police report was ever filed. Deputy Wells doesn't exist in any public records I can find. And sometimes, late at night in my studio apartment, I see a pale face reflected in my window. Just for a moment. Just long enough to see those hollow eyes staring back at me. Even though I'm 20 stories up, even though there's nothing outside but empty air. The tapping always follows. If you thought glass walls were terrifying, wait until you hear what was waiting in a frozen church basement in Vermont, where the ice itself seemed alive. Story 3. The frozen choir my name is Father Thomas Brennan, and I've been a priest for 32 years. I've heard confessions that would make your skin crawl, stories of violence and betrayal that test the boundaries of human depravity. I've performed 3 exorcisms in my career, 2 of which shook my faith to its foundation, and I've witnessed miracles that restored it, small moments of grace that reminded me why I took my vows. But nothing prepared me for what happened at St. Mary's Church in the winter of 2019. I'm 61 now, with gray hair and the kind of tiredness that settles into your bones after decades of service. I'd requested a quiet parish for my final years before retirement, somewhere I could tend to a small flock and find peace. The diocese assigned me to St. Mary's in rural Vermont, and I thought I'd found exactly what I needed. The church was old, built in 1847 by Irish immigrants, and sat on the edge of a dying town called Millbrook. The congregation had dwindled to maybe 20 people, mostly elderly, and the building was in desperate need of repairs. The roof leaked, the pews were warped, and the heating system rattled like it was breathing its last. But I loved it. There was a peace there, a quiet holiness in the worn wood and faded stained glass. Until the basement. The basement was used for storage, old hymnals with pages soft as cloth, broken pews stacked against the walls, Christmas decorations in moldering cardboard boxes. It was damp and cold year-round, even in summer, and smelled of mildew and stone and something else. Something ancient and undefinable. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, the wood groaning with each step. I rarely went down there. There was never a reason. But one December night, I heard singing. It was faint, distant, like a choir practicing in another part of the building. I was in my small rectory office, going over next Sunday's homily, when the sound filtered through the walls. I assumed it was the wind. These old buildings make strange noises, but the next night, I heard it again. Clearer. This time, voices, multiple voices, harmonizing in Latin. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the narrow stairs, my breath misting in the cold air. The basement was empty. The singing stopped the moment I reached the bottom, as if someone had flipped a switch. But the air was freezing, so cold it hurt to breathe. I could see my breath in thick clouds, and when I shone the flashlight around, I saw frost on the walls. Not just frost, ice. Thin sheets of it covering the stone, glittering in the beam of light. And the floor. The floor was covered in a thin layer of ice, smooth as glass. I knelt and touched it with my bare hand. It was real, solid, so cold it burned. But how? The furnace was running. I could hear it rattling away in the corner. The rest of the church was warm enough that I'd been working in shirt sleeves. I called a contractor the next day. He spent 2 hours examining the heating system, checking for leaks or failures, and found nothing wrong. Old buildings do weird things, he said with a shrug, packing up his tools. Probably just condensation freezing over. I'd keep an eye on it, though. If it gets worse, give me a call. But it did get worse. And the singing continued. Every night around 9 o'clock, the voices would start. Always the same hymn, always in Latin. I recognized the melody but couldn't place it. Something old, something that hadn't been sung in decades. I started going down to the basement every night, compelled by something I couldn't name. The ice grew thicker each time. Half an inch. An inch. 2 inches. And then, one night, I saw something beneath it. A shape. Dark and indistinct, like a shadow frozen in water. I knelt, pressing my face close to the ice, and shone the flashlight down. It was a hand. Palm up, fingers slightly curled, perfectly preserved beneath the surface. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see the delicate tracery of veins beneath. I jerked back, my heart hammering, and swept the flashlight across the floor. There were more. Dozens of them. Hands, faces, the curve of a shoulder, the outline of a head, all frozen beneath the ice, all staring up at me with open eyes. I brought a parishioner with me the next night, an old woman named Margaret O'Donnell who'd been attending St. Mary's for 60 years. She'd buried 2 husbands and 3 children, and nothing much rattled her. But when she saw what was beneath the ice, she screamed. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, crossing herself. "What is this? What are they?" We descended together, and this time the voices didn't stop. They grew louder as we reached the bottom, swelling until the basement was filled with song, a full choir, 40 or 50 voices, singing in perfect harmony. The sound was beautiful and terrible, reverberating off the stone walls. And beneath the ice, the faces had changed. Their mouths were moving, singing. Margaret fled up the stairs, her footsteps echoing, and I stood there alone, paralyzed, staring down at the frozen choir. Their eyes were open, looking up at me through the ice. And then, slowly, they began to move. Not their bodies, those remained still, but their heads turned, tracking my movements as I backed toward the stairs. One of them pressed a hand against the underside of the ice, then another, then dozens of them, palms flat against the surface, pushing. The ice cracked. Subscribe to Untold Fears and join thousands of listeners who know that the scariest stories are the ones that feel real. Hit that notification bell, because the next knock at your window might not be the wind. I researched the church's history in the town archives, poring through old newspapers and parish records. I found what I was looking for in a brittle, yellowed newspaper from December 1903. Tragic fire claims 43 lives at St. Mary's Church. The article described a fire that broke out during Christmas Eve Mass. The congregation, trapped by flames that blocked the main entrance, fled to the basement for safety. But the basement door jammed from the outside. Some said it was the heat warping the wood. Others whispered about sabotage. All 43 people inside died, or so the record said. But the article also mentioned something strange. When they finally opened the basement door days later, they found the bodies frozen solid, despite the fire still smoldering above. The townspeople said it was a miracle, a sign from God. They buried the dead in the churchyard and never spoke of it again. Except the basement was never excavated. The floor was never dug up. The bodies were never moved. They'd been sealed beneath the church for over a century. And somehow, they were still singing. I confronted the diocese. I demanded they send someone to investigate, to excavate, to give these people a proper burial. But they dismissed me. Stress, they said. Isolation. They suggested I take a leave of absence, see a therapist. So I went back to St. Mary's alone. The ice had spread beyond the basement now. It crept up the stairs, coating the first-floor hallway in a thin, slick layer. The temperature inside the church had dropped to freezing, even with the heat running full blast. My breath fogged in the sanctuary. And the singing had changed. It wasn't just at night anymore. It was constant. Day and night, the voices echoed through the building, sometimes beautiful, sometimes discordant and wrong, like the hymn was decaying along with the singers. I tried to bless the basement. I tried to perform a prayer of release. But when I descended the stairs with holy water and my Bible, the frozen faces beneath the ice opened their mouths wider, and the singing became a scream. I left St. Mary's in January 2020. I told the diocese I needed that leave of absence after all. The church was officially closed in March, citing structural concerns. It was deconsecrated and sealed, the doors chained, the windows boarded up. But I drive by sometimes. I can't help myself. And on cold nights, when the wind is right, I can hear them. The frozen choir still singing beneath the ground, waiting for someone to set them free. Or waiting for someone to join them. I have nightmares now. In them, I'm standing in the basement, and the ice is breaking. Hands reach up through the cracks, grabbing my ankles, pulling me down into the cold. And I'm singing with them, my voice joining the choir, trapped forever beneath the stone. I wake up gasping, my bedroom freezing, ice forming on the inside of my windows. I think they followed me home. But frozen choirs weren't the only betrayal. In a cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies, a family reunion would reveal that blood isn't always thicker than horror. Story 4, Blood Relations. My name is Sarah Hendricks, and I'm a high school English teacher from Denver. I'm 42, divorced for 5 years, and I have a 15-year-old daughter named Chloe. My relationship with my family has always been complicated. My older brother Marcus is a successful lawyer who never lets anyone forget it. My younger sister Vanessa works in tech and lives in California. And my father Richard is a retired military officer who rules family gatherings like he's still commanding troops. We're not close. We exchange obligatory cards on holidays and maintain a polite distance. So when my father announced he was renting a cabin in the Rockies for a week-long family reunion, I almost declined. But Chloe had been having a rough year. The divorce had hit her hard, and she'd become withdrawn and sullen. I thought maybe time with her uncle, aunt, and grandfather would help. Maybe the mountains would do us good. I was wrong. The cabin was massive, 3 stories, 6 bedrooms, with a huge deck overlooking a valley carved by a rushing river. It was November, and the trees were bare, their black branches stark against the sky. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air had that brittle, expectant quality like the world was holding its breath. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. Marcus and his wife, Jennifer, were already there, along with Vanessa, who'd flown in from San Francisco. My father arrived last, pulling up in a rented SUV with a cooler full of steaks and beer. He shook hands with Marcus, hugged Vanessa, and gave me a stiff nod. "Sarah, good to see you. Where's the girl?" "Chloe's inside," I said. "Her name is Chloe. Dad." He ignored me and headed for the cabin. The first night was tense, but manageable. We grilled steaks on the deck, drank wine, and made small talk about work and the weather. Marcus dominated the conversation as usual, regaling us with stories about his latest case. Vanessa scrolled through her phone, barely listening. My father sat at the head of the table, surveying us with that cold, evaluating gaze I remembered from childhood. Chloe sat next to me, picking at her food, and I felt the old familiar weight of family expectations pressing down on us all. The second night, things started to fall apart. We were playing cards in the living room, a forced attempt at bonding, when my father said, "You know, Sarah, if you'd tried harder with your marriage, maybe Chloe wouldn't be such a mess." The room went silent. I felt my face flush hot. "Excuse me? I'm just saying. Kids need stability. 2 parents. You gave up too easily." "You don't know anything about my marriage," I said, my voice shaking. "I know you quit," he said, taking a sip of bourbon, "just like you always do." Marcus chuckled, actually chuckled, and said, "Dad's got a point, Sarah. You were never exactly the resilient type." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Screw you, Marcus, and screw you too, Dad." I looked at Chloe, whose eyes were brimming with tears, and said, "Come on, honey. We're done here." We went to our room on the 3rd floor and locked the door. I held Chloe while she cried, and I promised her we'd leave first thing in the morning. But we didn't. Because that night, something else arrived at the cabin. I woke to the sound of scratching. It was coming from outside our window, long, slow drags, like claws on wood. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened. The scratching moved along the exterior wall, methodical and deliberate. "Mom?" Chloe whispered from the other bed. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said, climbing out of bed and moving to the window. I pulled back the curtain and looked out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Just the black shapes of trees and the faint outline of the deck below. Then, movement, something large and low to the ground, circling the cabin. I couldn't make out details, but I could see its eyes. 2 points of yellow light reflecting the dim glow from the living room windows. It stopped. Looked up. And I swear, it saw me. The next morning, I found deep gouges in the wood sighting beneath our window. 4 parallel lines, each about an inch deep, carved into the logs. My father inspected them with a frown, running his fingers along the marks. Bear, probably, he said, drawn by the smell of food. Those don't look like bear claws, Vanessa said, taking a photo with her phone. What else would it be? Marcus snapped. A werewolf? We laughed, nervous, unconvincing laughter, and my father organized a trip into town to buy more provisions and bear spray. Marcus and Jennifer stayed behind, claiming they wanted to enjoy the hot tub. Chloe and I went along, grateful for the excuse to get away from the cabin. In town, we stopped at a small ranger station to report the scratches. The ranger on duty, a woman in her 50s with weathered skin and sharp eyes, looked at the photos Vanessa showed her and went pale. "Where did you say you're staying?" she asked. Vanessa gave her the address, and the ranger's expression hardened. "That's the old Mercer property." "So?" My father said impatiently. "What's that supposed to mean?" "The Mercer family owned that land for generations," she said slowly. "They built the original cabin back in the 1920s. But they disappeared in 1987. All 6 of them. Search parties found blood, lots of it, but no bodies." She paused. "Some folks say something lives in those woods. Something that hunts families." "That's ridiculous," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," the ranger said, "but every few years someone rents that place, and every few years we get a call about strange noises. Scratches, missing pets." She looked at us seriously. "I'd leave if I were you. Tonight." We didn't leave. My father insisted it was nonsense, local folklore meant to scare tourists. Marcus agreed. Even Vanessa, usually the sensible one, seemed reluctant to cut the trip short. Only Chloe and I wanted to go, but we were outvoted. That night, the scratching returned. But this time, it wasn't alone. We heard footsteps on the deck, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Then the doorknobs began to rattle, one after another, front door, back door, the sliding glass door to the deck. Something was testing the locks, searching for a way in. We gathered in the living room, armed with fireplace pokers and kitchen knives. My father stood at the front window, staring out into the darkness, his face grim. "It's probably just coyotes," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Then we saw it. A figure on the deck. Tall, too tall, with limbs that were too long and bent at wrong angles. Its head was lowered, and in the dim light I could see its face, gaunt and elongated, with a mouth full of teeth that gleamed white. It pressed its hands, no, its claws, against the glass and stared at us with eyes that glowed like embers. Chloe screamed. Vanessa sobbed, and my father, the man who'd commanded soldiers who'd faced combat, stumbled backward and whispered, "What is that?" The creature tilted its head, studying us. Then it smiled, a terrible, too wide smile, and began to scratch at the glass. The sound was unbearable, a high-pitched shriek that set my teeth on edge. "We have to go," I shouted. "We have to leave now." But when Marcus ran to the front door and threw it open, he found more of them. 3 of them, standing in the driveway, blocking our cars. They didn't move. They just watched, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their mouths hanging open. We were surrounded. You've made it this far. Now subscribe to Untold Fears so you never miss a story that will haunt your dreams. Ring that bell, because the terror is just beginning. We barricaded ourselves inside. We pushed furniture against the doors and windows, turned on every light, and huddled together in the center of the living room. The creatures circled the cabin all night, scratching at the walls, rattling the windows, and making sounds. Awful, mimicking sounds. They imitated our voices, called our names in perfect replicas of our own speech. "Sarah, let me in," one of them said in my father's voice. "Sarah, it's cold out here." "Mom, help me," another said in Chloe's voice. "Mom, I'm scared." Chloe buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing. I held her tight and tried not to listen. At dawn, the sound stopped. The creatures vanished, melting back into the forest as the sun rose. We waited an hour, then 2, before cautiously opening the door. The driveway was empty. Our cars were untouched. But the cabin was covered in scratches, hundreds of them, carved into every surface, forming patterns that almost looked like words. We packed in minutes and fled. The ranger told us later that we were lucky. The Mercer family, she said, had been found eventually, pieces of them scattered through the woods, bones gnawed clean. Whatever lived in those mountains had been hunting there for decades, maybe longer. And it always targeted families. I don't speak to my father anymore. Or Marcus. Or Vanessa. Not because of what was said that weekend, but because I can't shake the feeling that we brought something back with us. That the creatures marked us, somehow, and they're waiting for the right moment to collect. Chloe has nightmares. She wakes up screaming, saying she hears voices outside her window. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them too. Scratching, calling our names, waiting. But the betrayal of blood wasn't the only horror waiting in isolated places. In the desert of New Mexico, an inherited house would reveal secrets that should have stayed buried. Story 5, The Inheritance. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I'm a data analyst from Austin, Texas. I'm 36, single, and I live a quiet, predictable life. I go to work, come home, watch Netflix, and try not to think too hard about where my life is going. So when I received a letter from a law firm in Albuquerque informing me that I'd inherited a house from a great uncle I'd never heard of, I was shocked and intrigued. The letter explained that my great uncle, Miguel Reyes, had died at the age of 93 with no immediate family. I was his closest living relative, and according to his will, I was to inherit his property in the desert outside a town called Mesilla. There were conditions. I had to visit the property, spend at least one night there, and sign papers indicating I accepted the inheritance. It seemed strange, but my curiosity won out. I requested time off work, rented a car, and drove to New Mexico. The house sat on 50 acres of scrubland, surrounded by nothing but sand, sagebrush, and distant mountains. It was old. Built in the 1950s, I'd guess, with adobe walls, a flat roof, and small windows covered in iron bars. The yard was littered with rusted machinery, old tools, and piles of wood that had baked dry in the sun. The lawyer who met me there was a stern woman named Miss Calderon. She handed me the keys and said, "Your great-uncle was eccentric. He lived alone out here for 60 years. Never married, never had visitors. The house is yours. But I should warn you, there have been stories." "Stories?" I asked. She hesitated. "People in town say this place is cursed, that Miguel made a deal with something in the desert. But that's just local superstition. I'm sure you'll be fine." She left, and I stood there alone in the fading light, staring at the house that was now mine. The interior was sparse and dark. The walls were thick adobe, which kept the house cool despite the heat outside. The furniture was old but well-maintained, a wooden table, a single chair, a narrow bed with a faded quilt. No TV, no computer, no phone line. Just books, shelves and shelves of them, mostly in Spanish, covering topics like folklore, mythology, and ritual magic. In the bedroom, I found a journal. It was leather-bound, the pages yellowed and brittle, filled with my great-uncle's handwriting. I sat on the bed and started to read. The entries dated back decades. Miguel wrote about loneliness, about the isolation of the desert, about the voices he heard at night. And then, about 20 years in, the entries changed. He wrote about something he called El Guardian, the guardian, a spirit that lived in the desert, that watched over the land and demanded respect. Miguel claimed he'd made an offering to it, a pact, in exchange for protection. The later entries were darker. Miguel wrote about dreams where he walked through the desert and found bones half buried in the sand. He wrote about feeling watched, about shadows moving in the corners of his vision. And in the final entry, dated just a week before his death, he wrote, "It knows I'm dying. It will come for its payment soon. I hope whoever inherits this place understands the debt doesn't die with me." That night, I heard digging. I was lying in bed, reading more of the journal by flashlight when the sound started. Rhythmic and steady, like someone shoveling dirt. It came from outside, somewhere in the yard. I got up and looked out the window, but the night was pitch black. No moon, no stars visible through the clouds. The digging continued for hours. I tried to ignore it, but the sound burrowed into my head. Finally, around 3 in the morning, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The yard was empty. But near the edge of the property, I found freshly disturbed earth, a hole about 3 feet wide and just as deep, as if someone had been digging and then stopped. There was nothing inside, just dirt and rocks. But at the bottom, scratched into a flat stone, were words in Spanish, El Guardian espera. The guardian waits. I should have left then, but something kept me there. Stubbornness, maybe, or curiosity. I wanted to understand what my great-uncle had gotten himself into, so I stayed another night. The digging returned, closer this time. I could hear it just outside my window, the scrape of metal against stone. I looked out and saw a figure in the yard, a shape darker than the surrounding night, hunched over, digging with its hands. I shouted at it, "Hey, who are you? What do you want?" The figure stopped, straightened, and turned to face me. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too thin to support its body. Its head was elongated, almost skull-like, and where its eyes should have been, there was only darkness. It stared at me through the window, and I felt a cold dread settle into my bones. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a sound like wind through empty caves. The debt must be paid. I locked myself inside and called the police, but there was no service. I was alone. The digging continued all night, circling the house, and by dawn, the entire yard was covered in holes, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle around the building. I found more words scratched into stones at the bottom of each hole. They formed a message, one life for another. The pact is eternal. I finally understood. Miguel hadn't just made a deal with the guardian, he'd offered something in exchange for his long life. And now that he was dead, the guardian wanted its payment. It wanted me. I fled that morning. I drove straight to the law firm and told Miss Calderon I rejected the inheritance, that I wanted nothing to do with that house or that land. She looked at me with pity and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Reyes. But you spent the night. You signed the papers. The house is yours. The debt is yours." "What debt?" I demanded. "I didn't agree to anything. Your great-uncle's will states that the heir must honor all agreements and obligations associated with the property. You accepted when you stayed." I stared at her, horrified. You knew. You knew what would happen." She didn't deny it. "I've been back in Austin for 3 weeks now, but the digging has followed me. Every night I hear it outside my apartment, the scrape of hands against dirt, the rhythmic excavation. I've found holes in the parking lot, in the park across the street, getting closer each time. And last night, I saw it. The guardian. Standing on the sidewalk outside my building, staring up at my window with those empty black eyes. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to break the pact, but I know one thing. It's coming for me. And soon, it will collect. But desert spirits weren't the only ones demanding payment. In the woods of Maine, a girl's weekend would reveal that some friendships hide darker truths. Story 6, The Cabin in the Pines. My name is Kelsey Patterson, and I'm a nurse from Boston. I'm 29, and I've been working double shifts at Mass General for the past 3 years, saving money, trying to build a life. My social circle has always been small, just a handful of friends from college. So when my friend Brittany suggested a girls' weekend at her family's cabin in Maine, I jumped at the chance. It had been months since we'd all been together. There were 5 of us: me, Brittany, Alexa, Morgan, and Jess. We'd been friends since freshman year, bonded by late-night study sessions and cheap wine, but over the years, we'd drifted. Brittany had gotten engaged. Alexa was pregnant. Morgan had moved to Seattle. We were all busy, all changing, and this trip felt like one last attempt to reclaim something we'd lost. The cabin was deep in the Maine woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through towering pines. It was small and rustic, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a porch overlooking a dark, still pond. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional cry of a loon. It should have been peaceful. The first night was good. We drank wine, played cards, and talked about old times. Brittany showed off her engagement ring. Alexa complained about morning sickness. Morgan told stories about her new job. And I listened, feeling both included and somehow distant, like I was watching them through glass. Around midnight, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up alone on the porch. The pond was black and still, reflecting nothing. I heard something then, a sound like whispering, coming from the woods. I strained to listen, but the words were too faint, too distorted. I went inside and locked the door, telling myself it was just the wind. The next morning, Alexa was gone. We woke to find her bed empty, her shoes still by the door. Brittany checked the bathroom, the porch, the yard. Nothing. Morgan called her phone, but we heard it ringing from her bag in the bedroom. Maybe she went for a walk, Brittany suggested, but her voice was shaky. Without her shoes? Jess said. Without her phone? We searched the area around the cabin, calling Alexa's name, but the woods swallowed our voices. After an hour, we decided to drive into town and get help. But when we reached the cars, we found all 4 tires slashed, clean, deliberate cuts that left the rubber hanging in shreds. We were stranded. We tried to stay calm. We told ourselves Alexa would come back, that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But as the day wore on, the fear grew. And then, just before sunset, we found something. Morgan discovered it near the edge of the pond, a pile of stones arranged in a circle, with symbols scratched into each one. In the center was a piece of fabric, Alexa's scarf, torn and bloodstained. Brittany started to cry. Jess grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is this? What the hell is this?" "I don't know," I whispered, but I had a horrible feeling that I did know. That this was planned, that one of us had done this. That night, we barricaded ourselves inside the cabin. We sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching each other, afraid to speak. The whispering returned, louder now, coming from all around the cabin. It sounded like voices, dozens of them, layered and overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. "Someone needs to tell the truth," Morgan said suddenly, her voice harsh. "This isn't random. Someone knows what happened." "What are you talking about?" Brittany demanded. "Alexa told me," Morgan said, looking at Jess. "She told me what you did." Jess's face went pale. "I don't know what you slept with Brittany's fiancé," Morgan interrupted. "Last month, at the engagement party, Alexa saw you." The room erupted. Brittany screamed at Jess, who denied it, then admitted it, then sobbed. I sat there, numb, as the friendship I thought I knew disintegrated in front of me. And then the lights went out. Subscribe to Untold Fears and join thousands who know that the scariest stories are the ones that feel real. Hit that bell, because the next knock might be for you. In the darkness, we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the cabin. Something was inside with us. "Who's there?" Brittany shouted, her voice cracking. A match flared to life, illuminating a face I knew. Alexa. But something was wrong. Her eyes were empty, her expression blank, and behind her I saw figures, shapes that moved like people but weren't quite human. "You betrayed me," Alexa said, her voice flat and emotionless. "All of you. You lied. You kept secrets. You pretended to be friends, but you wanted me gone." "Alexa, that's not true," I said, but even as I spoke, I remembered the resentment I'd felt. The jealousy when she got the promotion I wanted. The satisfaction when her relationship fell apart. She smiled, a terrible, empty smile. This place knows the truth. It feeds on betrayal. And now, you'll pay. The figures moved closer, and I realized they were us. Twisted, hollow versions of ourselves, born from our lies and resentments. We ran. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I remember running through the trees, branches tearing at my skin, the whispers chasing me. I remember reaching the road and flagging down a passing car. I remember the police searching the cabin and finding nothing. No Alexa, no bodies, no evidence. The others never made it out. Brittany, Jess, and Morgan were found weeks later, scattered through the woods, their bodies arranged in circles of stone. The official cause of death was exposure, but I know better. The cabin is still there. Still waiting. Still feeding on the secrets people bring. And sometimes, late at night, I hear Alexa's voice whispering outside my window. "You betrayed me too, Kelsey." But the betrayal of friends wasn't the only horror lurking in the wilderness. In an abandoned boathouse on the Mississippi, a weekend alone would reveal that some places remember every sin. Story 7, The Boathouse My Name, is Cameron Walsh, and I'm a freelance photographer from St. Louis. I'm 31, and I've spent the last 5 years documenting abandoned places, old factories, forgotten hospitals, decaying mansions. There's something about ruins that draws me, something about the way time erases human presence and leaves only echoes. So when I heard about an abandoned boathouse on the Mississippi River about an hour south of the city, I knew I had to see it. The place had a reputation. People said it was cursed, that bad things happened there. A family had drowned in the 60s. A drifter had been found murdered in the 80s. The usual small-town horror stories. I didn't believe in curses. I believed in decay and neglect and the way people's imaginations filled the silence. I was wrong. The boathouse sat on a bend in the river, surrounded by overgrown trees and tall grass. It was a 2-story structure, built from weathered wood that had turned gray with age. The lower level was partially submerged, the water lapping at the foundation. The upper level had windows with broken glass, and the roof sagged in the middle like a defeated spine. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late October. The air was cold, and the sky was heavy with clouds. I parked my truck on the access road and hiked in, my camera bag slung over my shoulder. The inside of the boathouse smelled like rot and river water. The floorboards were soft and treacherous, creaking under my weight. I could see through gaps in the wood to the water below, dark and slow-moving. The walls were covered in graffiti, mostly names and dates, but also strange symbols I didn't recognize. I spent the afternoon taking photos, documenting the decay. And then, as the sun began to set, I heard something. A voice. Distant and faint, like someone calling from far away. "Hello?" I shouted. "Is someone there?" The voice didn't respond. It just continued, a low rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from below, from the water. I should have left then, but I'm curious by nature, and I wanted to know what I was hearing. I found a ladder leading down to the submerged lower level and descended carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The water was waist-deep, cold and black. I waded through it, the chanting growing louder. It was coming from a corner of the room where the wall met the water. I shone my flashlight and saw something that made my blood run cold. Simples, carved into the wood just above the waterline. They were intricate and deliberate, forming patterns that hurt to look at. And beneath them, floating in the water, were objects, coins, jewelry, photographs, offerings. I reached down and picked up one of the photographs. It was old, faded, showing a family standing in front of the boathouse, a mother, father, and 2 children, all smiling. I turned it over and found writing on the back, "For safe passage, for forgiveness. 1967. The chanting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and oppressive, like the air before a storm. I heard something move in the water behind me, a slow, deliberate splash. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a figure rose from the water, a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Its skin was pale and waterlogged, its eyes empty sockets filled with darkness. It opened its mouth and spoke in a voice like grinding stone, "Why have you come?" I stumbled backward, dropping the photograph, and it sank beneath the water. I didn't mean, I was just exploring. "You disturb the offerings. You trespass." "I'm sorry," I gasped. "I'll leave. I'll leave right now." The figure tilted its head, studying me. Then it spoke again. "You carry guilt. I can smell it. What have you done?" And suddenly I was back in my apartment 2 years ago, standing over my girlfriend Emily's body. She'd overdosed, pills and alcohol, a combination I should have seen coming. I'd found her too late, called 911 too late. And I'd never told anyone about the fight we'd had that night, about the things I'd said, about how I'd left her alone when she needed me most. The guilt had been eating at me ever since. And somehow, this thing knew. "You owe a debt," it said. "Like all who come here, payment is required." I ran. I climbed that ladder faster than I thought possible and sprinted through the boathouse, ignoring the creaking floors and broken glass. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, and even then I could hear the chanting following me, echoing across the water. I drove back to St. Louis and tried to forget. But the boathouse wouldn't let me go. I started seeing it everywhere. Reflections in windows, shadows in puddles, the outline of the building in the shapes of clouds. And at night, I dreamed of the figure rising from the water, its empty eyes staring at me, asking over and over, "What have you done?" 2 weeks ago, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was the photograph I'd dropped. The family, standing in front of the boathouse. But now, there was a 5th figure in the image. Me. Standing behind the family, staring at the camera with empty eyes. And on the back, written in my own handwriting, "Payment required." I don't know what to do. I don't know how to pay the debt or break the curse. But I know one thing. The boathouse is waiting. And sooner or later, I'll have to go back. But the Mississippi wasn't the only river that remembered sins. In a small town in Louisiana, a church gathering would reveal that salvation comes with a terrible price. Story 8. The revival my name is Pastor Jacob Mills, and I've spent 25 years preaching the gospel in small towns across the South. I'm 53, widowed, and I've seen my share of miracles and tragedies. I've baptized children, married couples, and buried friends. I've counseled the desperate, comforted the grieving, and prayed for the lost. But I've never seen anything like what happened in Beaumont, Louisiana. I was invited to lead a revival at a small church called Grace Fellowship. The congregation had been struggling. Attendance was down, donations had dried up, and the previous pastor had left under mysterious circumstances. They needed someone to reignite the faith, and I agreed to help. The church was old, built in the 1800s, with white clapboard walls and a tall steeple that leaned slightly to one side. It sat on the edge of a bayou, surrounded by cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The interior was simple: wooden pews, a pulpit, and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. The revival was scheduled for 3 nights. I planned to preach about redemption, about God's forgiveness, about the power of faith. I thought I was there to save souls. I didn't realize I was the one who needed saving. The first night went well. The church was full, about 70 people, families and elderly folks, all eager to hear the Word of God. I preached about grace, about second chances, and I saw tears on faces, hands raised in prayer. It felt good. It felt right. But after the service, an old woman approached me. She was thin and frail, with milky eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She grabbed my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "You need to leave. This place isn't what it seems." "I'm sorry," I said, confused. "The church," she said urgently, "it's hungry. It takes payment for miracles. And the revival, it's how it feeds." Before I could ask what she meant, the congregation surrounded me, thanking me, shaking my hand. The old woman disappeared into the crowd, and I didn't see her again. The second night, things began to change. I preached about salvation, and the congregation responded with fervor. People shouted amen and hallelujah, and I felt the energy in the room, electric, almost overwhelming. At the end of the service, I called for people to come forward for prayer, and dozens did. I laid hands on them, one by one, praying for healing and blessings, and I swear I felt something flowing through me, a power that wasn't my own. A woman who'd been in a wheelchair for years stood up and walked. A man with cancer said his pain was gone. A child who'd been deaf heard her mother's voice for the first time. It was a miracle. Multiple miracles. The congregation celebrated, praising God, and I stood at the pulpit, overwhelmed and humbled. But that night, I had a dream. I was standing in the Anelum church, and it was full of people. But they weren't sitting in the pews, they were inside the walls, their faces pressed against the wood, their mouths open in silent screams. And I heard a voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the building, "Every miracle has a price." The third night, I discovered the truth. Before the service, I explored the church basement. I found old records, journals kept by previous pastors dating back over a century. And I found a pattern. Every few years, the church held a revival, and every time, miracles occurred. But in the weeks following each revival, people disappeared. Members of the congregation, one by one, vanished without a trace. The journals documented it coldly, clinically, 3 miracles granted. 3 souls taken. The balance must be maintained. I realized the church wasn't just a place of worship. It was something else. Something that traded miracles for lives. And the revival was how it chose its victims. I tried to cancel the final service, but the congregation insisted. They filled the church, expectant and eager, and I stood at the pulpit, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I wanted to warn them, to tell them the truth, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. So I preached. I preached about the cost of faith, about the danger of demanding signs and wonders. I begged them to leave, to abandon this place. But they didn't listen. They came forward for prayer, and I felt that power again, stronger now, almost pulling at me, demanding I use it. I refused. I stepped back from the pulpit and said, "I can't do this. You need to leave. Now." And that's when the lights went out. Subscribe to Untold Fears and never miss a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Hit that bell, because the next prayer might not be answered the way you expect. In the darkness, the church began to change. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing like a living thing. The pews creaked and shifted, and I heard voices, hundreds of them, whispering, pleading, screaming. The congregation panicked, rushing for the doors, but the doors wouldn't open. And then the walls opened. Faces emerged from the wood, pale, twisted faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They were the ones who'd been taken, the souls traded for miracles, trapped forever inside the church. They reached out with skeletal hands, grabbing at the congregation, pulling them toward the walls. People screamed. People fought. But one by one, they were dragged into the wood, their bodies sinking into the walls until only their faces remained, mouths open in eternal silence. I ran to the pulpit and grabbed the Bible, holding it up like a shield. In the name of God, I command you to stop. The voice boomed through the church. God doesn't live here anymore. I don't know how I escaped. I remember flames, the church catching fire, the stained glass shattering, the roof collapsing. I remember running through the bayou, stumbling through mud and water until I reached the road. When the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but charred timber and ash. And no bodies. The 70 people who'd attended that service simply vanished. The official report said it was an accidental fire, that the congregation likely evacuated and scattered, too traumatized to come forward. But I know the truth. The church took them. All of them. And sometimes, late at night, I hear their voices, whispering, praying, begging for release. I left the ministry after that. I couldn't preach anymore, couldn't ask people to have faith when I'd seen what faith could cost. But the church is still there, rebuilt, reopened. And every few years they hold another revival. And I wonder, how many more souls will it take before someone stops it? How many more betrayals before the debt is paid?